Hello there, and welcome to the return of Reach the Peak. If you're unsure what this show is, it's where I come back to Forza Horizon 3 on the Blizzard Mountain expansion to take cars up of the Devil Corners Hill Climb event. We give the cars snow tyres, but that is all the modification they're allowed, and then we see how well they do tackling this challenging hill climb course. For our return, we begin with the 2003 Porsche Carrera GT, 605 horsepower, 455 foot-pounds torque, 3,258 pounds of weight. This is the lightest car here today. With snow tyres on it, it is S2 class and 903 PI, which does make it the highest PI car here today as well. The Porsche Carrera GT, a car which I'm sort of in two minds about. In terms of its general design aesthetic, I'm not a huge fan of it. I don't think it's a particularly good looking car. It sort of looks like a stretched Porsche Boxster. But in terms of its engineering, I think this car's fantastic. It's got a wonderful V10 engine that sounds absolutely phenomenal. Yeah, it is a rather interesting supercar, to say the least. And of course, it was Porsche's only real supercar until the 918 Spider as of recent. As far as this car goes to drive, well, of course, as you can hear already, it does make a fantastic noise. But in terms of its actual driving characteristics, it is quite twitchy. Of course, with it being unmodified, it is running on its standard drivetrain, which does mean it is mid-engined rear-wheel drive. And as a result of that, yeah, not exactly ideal for rallying, unless you're a Lancia 037. Yeah, it does mean it's quite challenging. You do definitely need to be paying full attention. I mean, you should be paying full attention when driving up a course as challenging as this, but with the Carrera, yeah, it's something you really do need to do. It does have decent rear traction, which might actually explain some of the twitchiness. The front end's sort of the darty part of the car, which is kind of strange. Wasn't expecting that. It does feel like most of the weight is over the rear end, probably because it is. But overall, the Carrera GT, not a bad car to drive per se. Yeah, mid-engine supercars aren't going to do, or mid-engine rear-wheel drive supercars, I should say. They're never destined to do particularly well up a course like this, but it certainly isn't too bad. There's much worse choices you can make for tackling this hill climb course. Next up today, well, we've got a car that could actually prove to do quite well, provided it doesn't fall apart from bad build quality before it gets up the mountain. It is the 2016 Tesla Model S P90D, 532 horsepower, 713 foot-pound torque, 4,842 pounds of weight. This is the torquiest car here today. It is also the heaviest. PI-wise, with the snow tyres equipped, it is S1838 in PI. Of course, the Tesla Model S is an electric car, which in theory means it should be pretty darn good for climbing a course like this. Of course, with an electric car, you get instant torque, which is extremely helpful, and of course it is all-wheel drive as well, as most electric cars are, which does certainly help the Model S out. Honestly, the Model S might be my favourite Tesla. I'm not a huge Tesla fan, as you can probably gather. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of them or their business practices, or the person running them for that fact. But yeah, the Model S, it's not a bad looking car. Of course, build quality issues aside, it's not terrible. However, as far as it goes driving up here, it might actually be a little bit terrible. You see, this car, as I just said, four-wheel drive, electric, instant torque, it does have great potential to do well up here. However, it has one massive Achilles heel. It is too heavy for this course. It is, yeah, phenomenally heavy. 4,842 pounds is like rivaling some SUVs. In fact, this thing weighs 600 pounds more than a Porsche Macan. Yeah, this thing is not a light car because of all the batteries and the fact that it's four-door starting to begin with. It's got the panoramic roof and all the rest of it. And as a result, yeah, it's just too heavy. It understeers wildly. It's just not a great car, unfortunately. You can't take quite as much speed through the corners as you'd like to. On the straights, it is excellent because it can really get that power down. But, you know, this course is much more about how much cornering grip you have over how much straight line speed you have, and that's sort of where the Tesla does fall down a little bit. It's not a terrible choice. It'd probably be one of the quicker cars up here, but in terms of its actual potential, yeah, it is just falling a little bit flat. Next up today, we have the 1979 Hoonigan Loki Blazer K5, 650 horsepower, 600 foot-pound torque, 3,500 pounds of weight. This is the most powerful car here today. It is a 747 Pi. It does come factory equipped with the dirt/snow tyres. This was a car that was launched after Reach the Peak. The first sort of go of it had ended, the first 44 episodes. I don't know if you want to class this as a different season. I call this Reach the Peak Revival, but I'm not actually going to call the video that. It is episode 45. But yeah, this car was launched after Reach the Peak had become a thing, or had ended. The Blazer does show great potential. It has a lot of power. It is essentially a raid car. Oh, not a raid car, sorry. A, God, what do you call them? Trophy truck, essentially. If you actually look at the statistics of it and so on, you know, 650 horsepower, 3,500 pounds. Truck chassis, huge, big suspension, should be able to deal with the bumps nicely. In theory, it sounds great. Unfortunately, like a trophy truck, it is rear-wheel drive, which is sort of where it all falls down. To drive this is a very strange vehicle. It feels like it steers from the middle of it. It almost feels like it's on a pivot. It's very, very strange. It's entirely unlike anything I think I've driven before. You know, mostly with the trophy trucks, they just suffer from a lot of trying to get the power down. They're not particularly great through the corners, but they deal with bumps really well. This one, because it's sort of so short compared to a usual trophy trucks are usually like based on pickup trucks and so on, they're quite long. This is just based on a standard Chevy Blazer, which is sort of a more smaller, compact SUV. And as a result of that, yeah, it does sort of suffer a little bit. It's very strange to drive, very strange indeed. Honestly, it's something I find kind of hard to recommend, which is a bit of a shame, because in terms of the actual Hoonigan cars, this is probably my favourite, just in terms of its looking. It's an absolutely fantastic looking vehicle. Again, it does actually have great potential, and you could probably modify this thing to absolutely dominate this course. But just in terms of its stock form, yeah, it's just too weird to really drive, and that is a bit of a shame. Next up, well, I couldn't return to Forza Horizon 3 from Forza Motorsport 7 and not include a Toyota. And we have the 1992 Toyota Supra 2-litre GT today. 206 horsepower, 203 foot-pounds torque, 3,329 pounds of weight. A 713 is the PI of this vehicle when equipped with the snow tyres. This is a Mark III Supra, one that I'm not a huge fan of. I much prefer the Mark IV. The way I've always sort of drawn the line with this car is it reminds me a lot of an FCRX7, however it doesn't have any of the sort of rotary weirdness. In case you haven't gathered, sort of when it comes to cars, I like weirdness, and also, yeah, I just like weirdness and sort of good-looking cars. I mean, that's what most people like, good-looking cars, but yeah, I sort of value weirdness quite a lot in a car, and the FCRX7 certainly provides the weirdness, and I also think the FC is sort of a more, it's just a better looking design, in my opinion. It's sort of less fat looking, but, you know, the Mark III Supra certainly isn't a bad car. As a value prospect, it is absolutely fantastic. In the UK right now, you can pick these things up for like $2.5 grand, and you can pick up like a manual with turbo for about $5-6 grand. They're really very cheap compared to what you'd expect a Toyota Supra to be. As far as it goes to drive on this track, unsurprisingly, a 90s sort of low-powered rear-wheel drive sports coupe, it is sluggish to drive. It feels like it lugs a lot going up the mountain. It is okay, like, it's not a terrible car to drive. You know, obviously I've driven worse cars than this. I've driven the Camaros and the Firebirds and so on and so forth, and they really struggle with getting their power down and being sluggish and so on and so forth. Because this one is, it sort of feels slightly more sophisticated than those cars. The one issue I did find with this is traction feels very random. At some points you can sort of punch the throttle and it will just go, and it will go well. However, other times it will really bog down with the way it goes, and sometimes the rear end will like to come out and move around. It's a little bit of a random hodgepodge of how it's going to drive. You're never really quite sure sort of what Supra you're going to get through this corner. But overall, you know, as a car, again, I do find it very hard to recommend a front-engine rear-drive car for going up this mountain. The Supra certainly isn't one of the worst, however there is better alternatives out there. And finally today, well, I needed to find something with all sorts of, well, basically when I set out to do this episode I wanted all sorts of different drivetrains, and this is our front-wheel drive car today. It is the 2013 Dodge Dart GT with 184 horsepower, 171 foot-pounds torque, 3,303 pounds of weight, although there is a little asterisk next to that, I'll get to that in a second. And with the snow tyres equipped, it is B694 in PI. It is the least powerful car here today, the least torquey car here today, and the asterisks, well, I've added some cosmetic mods on, which I do allow in Reach the Peak, and they do add 7 pounds more of weight. However, they do add 2 PI, not quite sure why. It's got, I believe, the rear spoiler, rear bumper, and the front bonnet has been changed. I'm not sure if I changed the bumper on these, but I do allow them because realistically they don't make that much difference in this series as opposed to Top Gear Laps, which is very strict about modification. I already have to do modifications to the car with the snow tyres anyway, so occasionally I chuck a few visual mods on just to spice the car up a bit, and the Dart GT does have some pretty cool visual mods, although I should say quickly, I don't put on anything that actually like adjusts real downforce. The reason it's got this wing and not the cool rallycross wing is because that would make it adjustable. I don't go for any adjustable aero on the cars because that is actually kind of a major advantage. As far as this goes to drive, it is decent-ish. As far as front-wheel drive cars go, I've been saying this a lot today, there's certainly better choices out there. It does have a lot of issues at slow speed. The front wheels really like to sort of go straight. They don't really like turning at low speed, which is a big issue, but sort of once you get up to speed, it doesn't handle too badly. Yeah, it's quite weird just how understeery it is through some corners, yet how completely fine it is through others. I should point out, actually, I didn't really speak too much about the actual car itself. I really like the Dart GT. I think it's a great looking car, which is strange for me. I'm not usually a fan of sort of these small, compact American saloon cars other than some weird ones, but I actually quite like the Dart. I think it's a pretty good sort of econo box. And so on and so forth, and you know, it's got a nice Alpha Giulietta platform, so it should be a good car to drive as well. But yeah, as far as it goes to drive up here, understeer is a bit of an issue, but overall the Dart GT, not a bad car. Not the best here today, but by far and away not the worst car here today, and not the worst choice you can make when it comes to picking a front-wheel drive car. Anyways, on to the times, and the fastest car was, well, the Tesla Model S, as you may expect, with a 204.492, putting it into 19th place. It is slightly slower than a Lola, very slightly slower in fact, quicker than the Subaru Brat and the Warthog Audi R8, which is kind of surprising. You know, it was a good car, beats out GTRs and so on and so forth, but not quite as good as I was maybe hoping it to be. In 34th place, we find the Porsche Carrera GT with a 207.227, which is actually pretty good. Beats out by very slightly a CLK GTR, Koenigsegg 1.1, Koenigsegg Agera, which does make it sort of one of the better supercars to go up this track. Does get beaten by the McLaren F1, however. Moving down again, in 144th place, we find the Hoonigan Loki Blazer with a 221.241, which interestingly enough puts it only slightly ahead of the Ford F100 trophy truck, which is actually a pretty good comparison, both sort of aged trophy truck-like vehicles. Yeah, the Loki Blazer not quite as good as the F100 in my opinion though. And finally today, in 193rd place, we find the Toyota Supra 2-litre GT with 227.581, meaning it slightly beats out an S14 Sylvia, which is about where you'd expect it to go. And in 200th place, we find the Dodge Dart GT with 228.516, which amusingly enough, very slightly beats out a Plymouth Cuda. So there you go, the new Dodge Dart of new is better than old muscle cars, although I think the actual Dodge Dart is hanging around like a 224, so maybe not. Anyways, I do hope you enjoyed this episode of Reach the Peak, the return of Reach the Peak. Of course, as I mentioned at the start, this is going... Oh, I think I mentioned it at the start. This is going to be a couple of episodes run. We're going to run up to episode 50, and then I'm going to cap it off there. So hopefully you stick around to see that. Anyways, thank you all very much for watching, and until next time, farewell.
Celebration.